Hi there, this is Jordan Fink. So I'm giving the video response a shot, which is kind of funny because I actually just did a full response and then the audio was messed up. So anyway, I'm going to give this a shot in lieu of doing a written response and we'll see how it goes. So we're answering questions today, first week, on issues of ethics. Let's see, let me actually get the exact wording of the response. What types of questions should you investigate as far as cultural, societal, ethical, and political appropriateness, environmental, and economic? Can you think of any particularly appropriate or inappropriate technology examples? And how could you see yourself being involved in the engineering for global development sector or not? Well, I'm in the disadvantage of having already sort of answered this question, and now I'm like having to repeat something I already said. So we'll see what comes up. I first got interested in this kind of work years ago, mid-90s, late 90s, when I was a teenager growing up in Portland, Oregon. And one of the benefits of that time, that place, was not only do we have a pretty intact, multi-generational social network of people involved in a lot of different kinds of activism and art, culture that were happening at the time, we also had a very large number of young people, late 20s, early 30s, coming back from the Peace Corps and ending up in Portland. So I grew up as a teenager, invited into a culture of people who had just spent many years in Africa, Central America, South America, parts of the global South, who had been tasked with just sort of showing up in a community, and there maybe was or was not a project on hand that they would be involved in. And so a lot of times they would have to wander through and talk to people, get to know people in this village, and find out what people needed. And some of them had worked on successful projects, some of them had had a lot of failures, but we were really lucky to be surrounded by people who had really gone through that process, who had been trained in, I guess, what you would call humanitarian engineering, trained in bringing their expertise and work in service of communities that were disorganized by late 20th century, mid 20th century extractive processes, war, cataclysm, uneven geographic development. And so with that was a huge amount of ethical education in how do you go about working on a project? How do you make sure that something works? And one of the things that I think I learned at a pretty young age was, if it's not dialogical, if it's not done through conversation, you're going to impose something. That you are, as somebody going into a community, whether that's the global South, whether that's a neighborhood project in your own community, if you go in there with the idea that you are actually the expert, and you see your idea of expertise as you bring with you the hierarchy, the power, the resources, the money, the authority, and what with that comes something that can actually harm the project. So I'm trying to think of how I want to repeat some of the stories that I was thinking about with that. So one story, and so I learned a lot of permaculture back in the early days because it was viewed originally by its creators as an alternative to the global aid system and as a education curriculum that centered appropriate technology, ethical design. So we were taught the ethics of permaculture, which are that your first priority is to take care of the life support systems. You care for the earth. You do that in a strong sense of caring for the people. That's the second ethic. And the third is any surpluses generated should be redirected back towards infrastructure. So care for the earth, care for people, redistribute the surplus. How this actually looked, though, is that communities often would have priorities that wouldn't necessarily be the priorities that the engineer or the designer would prioritize. So a good example from this is there's a story in the amazing book Gaviotas, which is about a research institute in the Llanos region of Colombia that was designed because they were seeing people coming from the north, bringing in ideas about sustainable development and often missing the mark on what communities actually needed. And so they were like, well, let's go to the worst, they called it the worst place in Colombia, which is a flat area that would have been the Amazon, but it's a little too dry in the summer, so it burns. So it's a wet grassland and flat. And their idea was sustainable development for the global South from the global South. So, of course, they're educating people from Bogota and they're coming out into an area that's primarily indigenous. But one of the stories that they tell about the work that they did, there was a point at which there was some money available and a plane was flying around from village to village with funds saying, okay, we have some resources. What do you need? Do you need repair a section of your hospital? Do you need irrigation systems? Do you need, your waste treatment plant repaired, or like whatever your infrastructure is for dealing with sewage? And this one village in the story, and this is like a story the president of Colombia was telling people, said, okay, here's what we need. We need repair of all of the musical instruments in the village. And the person landing in the plane was like, wait, I don't think you understand. This is for like practical concerns. And they said, well, actually, we do understand. But we often find that we don't always agree at first on projects. We don't always agree on coordination. So we begin all of our meetings by playing music together. Having the capacity is the equivalent of having the room, right? Or having the space or having a good process. And for them, having their instruments, having everything available for them to play music together meant that everything else could go a little smoother. There was some inherent culture, community, and trust. And that's not just a cute story. That is actually saying that like the room and the ways that things are set up, the power dynamics, the ways that people interact with each other are the first technology. They're the first layer of engineering that needs to happen. And without dismantling power dynamics, you're going to be having a mismatch between solution and conditions. So what ethics really are is attunement, and design process needs to happen as a process of attunement. And so in my experience is doing lots and lots of design charrettes on a community level, it's really important not to go, you may have an idea of like kinds of tools you may use, but you don't want to do the thing of everything looks like a nail when you're a hammer. Attunement to site conditions, attunement to the community needs means that the people themselves need to be respected, that they have some degree of understanding of what their needs are, that they have potentially more literacy about site conditions than you have, even as an expert. Doesn't mean that they do. There may be ways that you are the expert. But you need to change your position of how you view yourself as an expert. So if you view expertise as your job as facilitator, then you can do what a facilitator does, which is, in Quaker consensus meetings or in consensus meetings in general, the facilitator gets up there and their job is to expertly represent the group. So they say, okay, what's a point of concern? And I've done this in public meetings for design process. I was working on a project in Hyannis, Massachusetts, where we were doing public meetings for the creation of a public transportation, biking, walking route. And you say, okay, what's on people's minds? And the group says, oh, well, issue A. And you're like, okay, I hear issue A, and you put it on the board. Somebody else says, issue B. And you're like, okay, I hear A and I hear B. And somebody says, oh, well, not B, C. And you're like, okay, well, we have issue A, we have issue B, but then we also have concerns about C. And you see a little bit of like fighting between the B and C people. So you step back and you say, okay, B people, what's going on? Why is B so important? C people, what's going on? Why are you so concerned? And you start working your way back through it. That process is really important. As the engineer or as the designer, then you don't have to just be the verbal version of that. You can be the solution version of that. So you can take your crayon. It's important to have low fidelity. So I think an important ethical piece is that the fidelity of an image, the fidelity of information needs to be at the level of the design process. If I come to a meeting with a perfectly beautiful drawing or a perfectly engineered solution, it's going to close down people's minds. They'll think the decision's already been made. I either need to acquiesce or I need to challenge it. But if your ideas are rough, if you keep it on the conceptual stage, then people can say, okay, it's still conceptual. I can play with it. And the moment you see criticism, you draw right on that thing. So we were taught, even if you had computer engineering drawings, trace over it, use crayons, use vellum, make something loose. And then as things are decided, the community can decide that together and you refine. So that's S2. I remember working on a project. So you show your image and you say, does it look like this? And they say yes or no. And you modify it. And then your work, your expertise becomes the way that you can crystallize what the group is actually saying for itself. And it's amazing that iterative, recursive process is one that actually generates design in a way that is different than it sort of springing from somebody else's inspiration or the solving of particular parameters. On the other side, I can think about an example where I was working in the city of Portland. So, humanitarian engineering, and we're talking about not just the third world, we're talking about our own communities. I was involved in design projects where I was facilitating 20 site designs back in 2004, I think. The 19 of the projects, man, they were rough. Neighbors were conflicting. There were all these issues. There was this one project that was doing really, really well. And so it was a relief to me to not have to deal with it. You just report back and be like, our meeting went great. Our potluck went great. And so the other meetings were getting my attention. I was going to them. I was really trying to work through ideas. We're about to be in construction, and some of these neighbors are building piazzas and public squares. Some of them are building ovens and community spaces. Some are building little sheds or spaces for children to like put, playhouses, that kind of stuff. Some of them are having hot water and tea stations for community gathering of food, all this stuff, shelter. And most of those projects were on public right of way. And in the city of Portland, we had made it so that permit wise, you had to have 90% approval in order to get a project through within like a 2-block, 3-block radius. So that was like the incentive, getting that approval. So if somebody had a disagreement, man, they were important and they were included and we worked through it. One project, for example, one neighbor showed up late after a lot had been decided. And he was like, I hate this idea. They were painting a giant sunflower in the street. They had all these benches and he was just ready to stop it. But rather than fighting him on it, we talked to him. And it turned out that he actually was an artist and had some pretty interesting ideas. He ended up being a metal worker who created this incredible metal gate that was compatible with the whole thing. So the inclusion of him was actually an important part. And the stepping back and taking our time to actually like bring in all the voices was really important. It made something better than any of us could have imagined. But this one site was too good to be true, it turned out. So the project happened. Towards the end, the person said, we've decided that it makes more sense just to put it on the corner of my property. And it'll be available for everybody, and it'll be a bench and a sitting area and cook like a cooking stove kind of thing, pre-technology cooking stove. And I was just like, great, okay. You don't have to go through as much of a permitting process for that because it's on your private property, but it's facing and there for the community. And it still hits our goals of things that are useful for the larger community. So event happened, things got constructed, it seemed fine. And then a year later, I was working for a social scientist at Portland State University who was doing a study of our projects. And so I was just doing transcription, going through the surveys. All those 19 projects, people were like, oh, well, it was a hard process, but we worked through it. And now I have an example of having trusted my neighbors. I know my neighbors. I know their kids. Like we get together. We come together every so many months or every so many years to like work on these repair of these projects or add to them. We have festivals, that kind of thing. This one site that I thought things had gone smooth with had the worst reviews. People felt worse after the event. They felt bad about the neighbor. They felt bad about the process. And as I started to sort of decode this, I started to understand what had happened was that because he could offer his corner, he was able to sort of sidestep the actual conflict process, the resolution process, the community design process. And he ended up creating something that for him was his like evaluation of what the community said it needed. So it wasn't that he was trying to do anything wrong. But because there was no need for community support, he could just move ahead. He could steamroll. And little things that bothered people, they didn't have the process of being heard. They didn't have the process of working together. And so now it's a standing monument to their inability to work together. People don't sit there. The people who use it are tourists who are coming through the neighborhood. People who look at it associate it with that guy who sort of just did his thing and like didn't really listen to people. So I had to be really careful in projects after that because I realized I had empowered what I would say was inappropriate technology that did not match the social context, that did not resolve conflicts, that did not take into account that we're actually trying to build something that can take care of itself, that does something for the community. Instead, it's a symbol of something else to the community. And this guy has to put in energy to keep it up because it is made of earthen materials and it is, a perishable thing. So it's not sustainable. But the other ones, they're stone soup. People come and repair them all the time. People actively take care of the projects because it's dear to their heart. So for me, that's at the core of the ethical process. It doesn't really matter what you're designing. Mood, the tone, the quality of communication, and the trust that you actually have to have in people to know their own circumstances. They will reinvent the world from scratch if given the right cooperative context. They will create food systems. They will create infrastructure. They will create waste removal systems. If you're an expert, you can help facilitate that. You may know the toolkit of solutions, but your real job is to demonstrate listening, to demonstrate creating of space. So one other cool appropriate technology project I'll bring up is that interesting village Gaviotas, they were living there for years. And one of the issues in the Llanos is that the clean water layer is well under the surface. There's a brackish layer on top. So water pumping ends up being a major issue, and it takes a lot of fuel and energy in these villages in Colombia. Somebody developed a water pump like a sleeve pump, and they reversed the sleeve part and the main part. I don't actually know very much about pump technology, other than I've seen this thing work. And what it meant was that both strokes of the pump move water. So they were able to half the amount of energy, and there were some reasons why this technology was great. It's a great book. Their choice was that they attached these pumps to playgrounds, to the seesaws. So the community effort of, pumping water was actually just already taken care of on the playgrounds of the schools. Totally appropriate. There's already an action happening, and then play becomes the way that water gets moved. And every day the children come out from school and go pump water for their village. There's a kind of coherence there that is elegant. So I don't know if I answered all the questions. I'll just look real quick again. Cultural, societal, ethical, political appropriateness, environmental, and economic. Yeah, I think we got there. How do I see myself being involved in the engineering for global development sector? I have concerns about global development as a tool of IMF, World Bank, structural adjustment, and the history of American colonialism as part of that. And at the same time, though, aid, humanitarian work, we need it. I mean, I had a lot of friends who went down and took care of things in Katrina, after the Katrina, and they used appropriate technology. They used composting toilets. Here in Portland, we have a plan where, people have buckets and sawdust, and if the water supply crashes, we have the ability to teach people very quickly how to compost thermophilically. Learning those kinds of things in our community level is really important. And I think that the work that I'm probably going to be doing for the rest of my life is work that is about helping communities apply solutions and make good decisions together that improve and enhance their sense of community and their ability to work together. Because without that, then you end up having collapses in resources. You have people not sharing. You have people too much redundancy, not enough mutual learning. So I'm excited to be in this class with all of you. I think I kind of took a little bit longer than my last attempt at this, 20 minutes. But I'll try to make an edited version and post this. Nice to meet all of you.